Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Gallery, where we're meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. I'm Lucina Ward, and I'm one of the curators here, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians, to elders past and present, and welcome other Indigenous people tonight. Before I welcome our speaker, I need to make a short apology on behalf of the National Gallery. Despite our best efforts, we don't, as advertised, have a sign interpreter for tonight's lecture. It's a busy time of year, so bear with us, and apologies again. One more tiny bit of more housekeeping. If anyone has a mobile phone with them, grateful if you just quadruple check that it's on silent. Carol Jacobi is Curator of British Art from 1850 to 1915 at Tate. Dr Jacobi has worked internationally as a curator, lecturer and writer on 19th and 20th century art. She's worked mainly on the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and associated artists, and especially on William Holman Hunt, but also on 19th century photography. Please keep that in mind. It's a really fascinating series of connections here. But as well as that, she's also worked on Francis Bacon, Isabel Rawson and The Circle. And in 2008, she was the Leverhulme Research Fellow at the National Portrait Gallery, London. Also in 2008, Carol worked on Sin and Salvation, William Holman Hunt and the Pre-Raphaelite Vision, a really insightful exhibition which brought new knowledge and interpretation to Hunt's work and was shown at the Manchester Art Gallery, in Canada, in Toronto, and in the USA at Minneapolis. Now, more recently at Tate, Carol has curated Painting with Light, art and photography from the Pre-Raphaelites to the modern day, and two earlier exhibitions about 19th century photography, Salt and Silver, and The Poor Man's Picture, Victorian art and stereoscopic photography. Carol is also lucky enough and rather tired at times to be working on Van Gogh and Britain for 2019. So we're really, really thrilled that she's been able to carve out some time from a busy program to come to Australia. Now, Carol has been a wonderful expert collaborator and a terrific colleague on Love and Desire, Pre-Raphaelite Masterpieces from the Tate. So please join me in welcoming Carol.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the National Gallery of Art for inviting me here. It's been an absolute pleasure and a revelation at times. Thank you for coming tonight, and also thank you to Lucina in particular for curating such a beautiful exhibition for me to talk about. So I'm going to focus in this talk on the theme of love and desire, love in particular, but hopefully we'll be able to meet up in the exhibition afterwards when I'll show you another couple of pictures on a slightly different theme. So we have to start off, when we're thinking about the Pre-Raphaelites, we have to start off really with London. London in 1848, when the Pre-Raphaelites got together, was by far the largest city on the planet, and it was also the most technologically advanced city on the planet, because Britain at this point was sort of leading the Industrial Revolution. So everyone was interested in science, all sorts of exciting things were happening, like we were getting sewers, and they were sort of thinking about building the first London Underground. There was also commerce coming in from all over the world, and people exploring the world because of new trains and steamboats and so on. And a sort of statistic that always completely astonishes me is that at the beginning of the 19th century, only 1 in 5 people lived in a city. And by the middle, only 1 in 5 people was left in the country. So this massive change, and that's what I really want to underline, is that it was a period of incredible change and incredible pace of change. So who were the Pre-Raphaelites? Well, the Pre-Raphaelites were essentially art students, and they studied here. The Royal Academy of Arts in those days was actually situated in London's National Gallery. And I just introduce you to them. There were 7 founding members. We have Dante Gabriel Rosetti there, who thought of himself as rather handsome, as you can see. That's in the self-portrait. John Everett Millay. He was the youngest student ever to go to the Royal Academy. He arrived at the Royal Academy at the age of 11. His parents actually moved to London, especially so he could go. And he won his first prize at the age of 12, and he was like the golden boy of the Academy. Rosetti had actually already dropped out, and William Holman Hunt, who was sort of Millay's best friend, he'd really struggled to get into the Academy, and actually Millay had helped him. And they sort of got together. They decided they wanted to have 7 members. So you see here the other members. You also see along the side sort of associates of the Pre-Raphaelites who were never a member of the group, but are really important. In particular, Ford Madox Brown, who I'll come back to at the bottom, but also you see Elizabeth Siddall, who is an artist, and Christina Rosetti, who is a poet. And of course, women couldn't study art at the Royal Academy in these days, so that's why they weren't part of the original founding group. And I love this little drawing by Holman Hunt. They would get together and talk all night, drink coffee. That's the coffee pot there that you can see was a very important part of their apparatus. Read poetry to each other and sort of have great ideas, just like students still do today. I hope they do anyway. And they agreed on the fact that they were completely frustrated at the art school. And what they particularly hated was the dominance of the old masters and the way they were being taught to, as artists, to emulate older artists. And this is where their name comes from, Pre-Raphaelite. They actually quite like Raphael, though I put this one up because this was Holman Hunt's most hated painting. But they didn't like late Raphael. They didn't like artists who emulated and copied Raphael. They thought artists should think for themselves. And you can kind of see what they were getting at. You can see that all the figures are very idealized. They all look the same, really, a bit, don't they? They're all sort of in this floaty drapery, like nobody's actual clothes ever fall. And they're all in very sort of histrionic poses. And this painting also sort of sets out the rules that these artists were learning, that you should always arrange a picture in some kind of pyramid. And that you should always light things from one side, so everything's got a shadow down the other side. And the Royal Academy had been founded by a British artist, Sir Joshua Reynolds, and he very much followed this sort of Raphaelite style, which you can see here in this sort of rather affected portrait that's in the Tate, three ladies adoring a term of Hymen, and you can see they've even got their lovely classical statue there. And you can see all the same rules have been followed. And the Pre-Raphaelites actually called Sir Joshua Reynolds Sir Sloshua Reynolds, because they felt it was, kind of muddy and sloppy way of painting. And when they were at the Royal Academy, the new president was Sir Charles Eastlake. And you can see again, he's following, you're getting the hang of the style. You can see he's following that style. And so, Millay, in fact, was very successful at this style. This is one of the paintings he won a prize for. 1846. He was 16 when he won the prize, when he painted this extraordinary picture. It's got everything. It's got the shadows down one side. It's got the pyramid, the whole caboodle. So when Millay exhibited this at the Royal Academy, what we've got is essentially pre-Raphaelite Millay, and now we've got post-Pre-Raphaelite Millay. You can see that it was a really striking change. You can see that gone are the shadows, that everything is brilliantly lit, and everything is the colour it is. The colours are much, much brighter, even though this is quite a drab scene in a carpenter's shop. And you can see that the figures, none of that idealization. Look at the arms of Joseph. Millay actually went and found a grocer, somebody who did a lot of manual labor, because he wanted arms with just the right kind of muscles. And you can see that, that all that sort of a nice drapery is not there. That the cloth falls and crumples and so on. And I've put this painting up because this was the painting that really caused all the scandal. When Millay exhibited this, everyone was absolutely horrified that he should treat the Holy Family, as they saw it, in what they saw as a really disrespectful way. Even Dickens, who was a great hero for the Pre-Raphaelites for his realistic, innovative writing and novels, he actually said that he thought Mary looked like someone from a gin palace. And if you think about Jesus here, the child Jesus, look how different he is from those little sort of cherubic children in the East Lake. He's much more a natural child, and people were very shocked by this. So what was behind this? What was behind this change? Well, one of the things the Pre-Raphaelites talked about in their long evening smoking and drinking coffee was a whole new set of heroes. If they weren't going to emulate the old masters, if they weren't going to emulate Raphael and so on, who were their heroes? Well, actually, you can see on this list that Raphael's there in the top right-hand corner. They didn't mind him. They just minded people who copied him. But you can see it's sort of quite a motley crew. They love Shakespeare. He gets 3 stars. But they also love Edgar Allan Poe. They love the Romantic poets. You can see Keats there. He was very important to them. But they also love medieval writers like Chaucer, and also medieval painters like Fra Angelico, and modern, can you just tilt that for you? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And also modern poets like Tennyson, who was the poet laureate, but also Mrs. Browning, you can see there. And one hero who was very important to them, who's not on the list, was an artist of their own time, Ford Madox Brown. And Ford Madox Brown was born on the continent. He was very, very worldly. He'd worked in Paris, he'd worked in Rome. He'd actually seen a lot of this medieval art, which the Pre-Raphaelites hadn't had a chance to see. And he was already sort of exploring some of these ideas. So this painting in the exhibition celebrates Chaucer, celebrates medieval art, celebrates the sort of British tradition. This is one of my personal favourite pictures at the Tate. It's not a very famous one, but I really love it. And this is Ford Madox Brown's Our Lady of Good Children. And you can see that he's thinking about medieval Madonna and Child. You've got the architecture and this beautiful landscape that you see through it. He was a particular fan of Memling, who was a northern early Renaissance painter. But you can see actually that what he's doing that's so radical is he's combining this medieval art, these new heroes for artists, with the modern, with the here and now and the today. And the other title of this picture was Our Lady of Saturday Night. And what that was referring to was the tradition of Victorian mothers to bath their children. They only bathed once a week in those days, to bath their children on Saturday night. And if you actually look at the picture, you can see that it's actually Brown's own daughter that's sitting on the angel's lap on the right-hand side, his daughter Catherine. And what I really love about it is the gesture of washing between the child's fingers and the wetness of the skin. And this is because Brown is actually not just looking at medieval art, he's also looking at his own children. And in fact, this is particularly poignant because his wife had died only a year before, and he was bringing up his daughter Catherine on his own. So the idea of the mother bathing the child was particularly poignant for him, I think. So Brown had seen all these medieval arts, but the Pre-Raphaelites themselves, they hadn't. There wasn't that much of this kind of thing in Britain. They hadn't had a chance to travel abroad yet. What they were mainly doing was actually looking at illustrations in books, and the print trade was just exploding at this point, so suddenly there were more illustrations around. So these were the sort of things they were looking at. They're not that inspiring, are they? They're also looking at the prints of Hogarth. Hogarth was a real pioneer of modern life subjects. We think of modern life painting as to do with the Impressionists and French painting, but actually it was something that had been going on in Britain for quite a long time. And Hogarth in particular looked at the world around him as sort of the very critical eye, as you can see here in this print here. So they were looking at these kind of prints. And there were actually a couple of pre-Raphael paintings in the National Gallery that particularly inspired them. One of them was Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini Marriage, which has just got the most stunning detail in it, as I'll show you later. And another one was an Italian pre-Raphael painting, Lorenzo Monaco's altarpiece of the Virgin and the Saints. And so they really made the most of these few things they knew. So these are actually the first 3 paintings that the Pre-Raphaelites painted and exhibited. They were kind of like manifestos in paint. They were saying, right, look, this is what art should be like. And you can see, it's got a little light on it. You can see, hopefully, if you look at the white saint on the right-hand side of the Monaco altarpiece, can you see that the exact same, that's been copied by Rosetti in the bottom picture, the Girlhood of the Mary, the sort of 2 figures looking at each other, one in the lighter fabric. And you can see exactly the same arrangement on the right-hand side of the Millay painting in the middle. And you can also see the way that they've also adopted the very bright colours. These clean, bright colours are much more intense, much more aesthetically powerful and striking. And they've adopted this kind of rather crowded, overlapping way of arranging their figures. None of these pyramids are people anymore. And so the other thing that they've done is that they've completely got rid of the brown colour. And that's because they sort of decided that they were only going to use the purest, brightest pigments in their paintings. But the final radical thing that you can see from looking at these pictures is that they were painted from life. So that every single figure in these paintings is actually a portrait of a friend, because they couldn't really afford models, so they tended to use their friends to paint from. Or, for example, Christina Rossetti, the poet, has posed for the Virgin, the bottom picture. That's actually Rossetti himself vowing to revenge his brother at the top. And so, so these were their manifestos in paint, that painting should be truthful. It should look at the real world. And if it did look at other art, it should actually be much more adventurous in the kind of things it was looking at. Looking at modern artists like Ford Madox Brown, also looking at medieval artists. And the picture in the middle is actually a subject from Keats. So they're bringing everything in. All their heroes are coming together. So I think I hopefully understood why they call themselves the Pre-Raphaelites and what this actually meant to their art. But why brotherhood? Well, 1848 was the year of revolution. All over Europe, there were popular uprisings going on. And in London, there was a group called the Chartists, and they were campaigning for more rights for working people. And actually, an enormous number of them gathered on Kennington Common in London, and Hunter Millay actually went down to join them. They were very much in sympathy with this idea that there should be more rights for people, the idea of a broadening democracy. At this point, only few people could vote. Not everyone didn't have the vote. And they were very interested in the labouring man. And this was the beginning of what we now think of as socialist politics. And the Pre-Raphaelites were really into that. So by calling themselves a brotherhood, they were allying themselves with early guilds, with these brotherhoods, these revolutionary sort of cells and sects. And that's one of the reasons they wanted to have 7 members, because it sort of added to the mystery of that. And what they did was they, in order to identify themselves as this rebel group, they agreed that they'd always include PRB after their signature and their pictures. And but they wouldn't tell anybody what it meant. So people, of course, made up all sorts of scurrilous possibilities. But they were quite right, because actually when they did reveal what it meant, there was a huge backlash against them. Press really got onto them because they felt it was incredibly arrogant to sort of put themselves above Raphael and the old masters. And you can see, if we go back to their sort of their list of heroes, that actually there are several actual revolutionaries on it. Renzi, who we saw in the painting just now, Kosciuszko, who was a Russian revolutionary, and Cromwell, who is a big hero. So let's now take a look at some of the paintings in the show. And the earliest painting in the show is Rosetti's Annunciation. And you can see that this is an incredible radical painting. He's taking a religious subject, even though the Pre-Raphaelites were actually atheists, but they felt that these religious stories had a kind of impact and intensity that they were interested in. And so Rosetti takes the Annunciation, which was a subject which you could find in medieval paintings. Jan van Eyck's Annunciation is one that Rosetti knew quite well. He takes that and he modernizes it. He uses these beautiful colors of the early medieval paintings to create what he actually said, I want to make a picture that's entirely white, because he knew that the color would have this tremendous emotional effect, that it would actually create a sort of sense of strangeness and dreaminess, as well as poetry. So he makes this white painting, and his sister Christina Rossetti poses for the Virgin, and he imagines the psychological effect on Mary of this angel coming into her bedroom and telling her that she was going to have the Son of God. He imagines how frightened she would have been, and he shows that in Christina's pose. So you can see the way her shoulder is sort of shoved against the wall, the way she's just in her night clothes. She's not in her sort of wonderful robes, so she seems incredibly vulnerable. And this is sort of, so Pre-Raphaelitism wasn't just bringing greater naturalism to painting, but also a greater psychological naturalism, really sort of thinking about people's thoughts and people's feelings, and about how you show those invisible things to people in a visible medium. You can see that he's stolen a few ideas from religious painting. He's used symbols such as the lily. But at the same time, he's also used some very modern techniques by using the pose of Mary to show her feelings. Perhaps the best example is Ophelia. And here, Millay has taken the national treasure, William Shakespeare, his most famous play, Hamlet, and he's taken a scene from it, the Drowning of Ophelia, that in the actual play, it takes place off stage. The Queen Gertrude describes the death of Ophelia, the way she was picking flowers along the riverbank. She fell into the stream, and she was so distracted by her trauma of the way she'd been treated by Hamlet and the death of her father. She was so distracted that she just let herself drown. But what Millay has done is he's taken that sort of offstage death and he's brought it as close to us as it could possibly be. He actually spent 5 months sitting next to a real stream, painting every bit of bark, every flower, every leaf, every blade of grass, the exact sort of ripples of the stream. He started in the summer, and he had to actually build himself a little shed when it sort of started getting cold in November. And when he'd done that, he actually went back to London, and he actually asked Elizabeth Siddal to pose for him, and he made her wear a wedding dress and lie in a bath of water because he wanted to look at, sorry, what's happened here? What have I done? He wanted to look at exactly what a piece of fabric looks like as the water's seeping into it, what her hair looked like as it disappeared under the surface of the water. It's the most extraordinary effect, isn't it? And so what he was doing is something which I call it close looking. It's literally close looking, that he's literally very close to his subject and spending many days, weeks, months examining it. But at the same time, it brings us very close in a psychological way, in that we are literally very close to Ophelia at this tremendously personal moment, the moment of her death. We're completely enveloped in her surroundings. Most landscapes have a horizon and some sky. There's no, very, very radically, there's no horizon and sky in this. So that you get this extraordinary sort of psychological intimacy again with Ophelia. So you can see that, the way that very quickly Pre-Raphaelites moved on. Again, the color is used in an extraordinarily powerful way, but in a totally new way. This green is a new industrial pigment, emerald green, and he's painted a painting that's almost entirely green. And I think it's just that sort of shock of the green that sort of is one of the reasons it's so beloved, one of the reasons it has such an impact on the viewer when you stand in front of it. Sorry, this is this is a tiny area of paint, and the fact I can blow these pictures up to such a degree without them losing it, I think gives you a sense of the extraordinary detail that Pre-Raphaelites are exploring. Now, these paintings of women are in a way reflecting the Pre-Raphaelites' own preoccupations and their own lives. And as a group of young men, they were very much sort of rebelling against the expectations of, they sort of came from lower middle class backgrounds, but they were rebelling against the expectations of their families, who expected them to make nice, safe, respectable marriages. And I love this little drawing in a letter by Holman Hunt, which shows him being sort of nagged by a woman, a very kindly woman who he loved very much, but she was always trying to match him up with respectable ladies, and which he never gave in to. And so a lot of these paintings actually reflect what was actually going on in the lives of the Pre-Raphaelite brothers. So, for example, this amazing picture, unfinished, by Ford Madox Brown, of his wife, called "Take Your Censer," on one hand, it's a little bit like an early Renaissance painting or medieval painting. It's a little bit like a Madonna with the mirror acting like a halo. But on the, you can see that he's actually taken the mirror from the Arnolfini marriage here, and he sort of used that trick. But you can see in the mirror the man in this scene. He's the father. He has his hands out, ready to take the baby. And nobody really knows what is meant by the title of this picture. Is she sort of saying, look, this is your responsibility, look what you've done to me, take responsibility for your son? Is it an illicit, is it an illegitimate child? Or is she saying, look, fantastic, look, here's your son, in a sort of really positive way? I feel the way she's holding the baby is not that maternal, which is really shocking. Victorian times, women were always expected to be maternal, and if they had babies, there was a certain sort of formula for that. And I think even today, we find it quite shocking that she's holding the baby in that way and sort of pushing it towards the viewer. And this related to Brown's actual relationship. He had met somebody new. She was a farm girl. And she had no education when he met her, and he had to marry her in secret. They'd had a baby together. Before they were married, he'd married her in secret. So I think his own sort of anxieties about his responsibility to her, whether he was sort of leading her astray, are reflected in this painting. Another personal favourite of mine is the Millay's Order of Release, which is ostensibly a historic scene showing showing a woman getting her husband out of jail. And I absolutely love it because she's such a powerful woman. All the men, the males in this painting, we don't see their faces. Their eyes are covered. But she is the only person's gaze that we see, so we're sort of totally focused on her thoughts. and finally sort of getting her husband back. And I just love this, the hands there, the way she's holding her husband's hand, and just next to it is a little child's hand who's been holding a little posy of flowers, which he's bought to give to his father, but he's fallen asleep because they've had to wait so long. And this relates, the model for this picture is actually Effie Ruskin, the wife of Millay's main patron, John Ruskin. And they had been spending time together, and as you can see from these little drawings that Millay made, they had become very intimate, and Millay and Effie had fallen in love. And I love this picture. She's cutting his hair, and he's got plaster on his nose because he accidentally banged his nose swimming earlier in the day. And what Effie did was she actually left her husband. She took him to court and had the marriage annulled because of non-consummation. It had never been consummated. And so she was able to marry Millay. So there was really a kind of order of release. And they had a very happy marriage. And perhaps the most famous example is William Holman Hunt's The Awakening Conscience. Again, you can see he's been inspired by that Van Eyck. There's square mirrors in the background this time, not a circular one. But it's a very sort of, it's a scene within a room, and all the things in the room tell you this story. So, for example, in the foreground, you have these sort of dirty shoes. Of the Van Eyck, you have these dirty shoes, which tell the story of somebody coming in from outside. In the foreground of The Awakening Conscience, you have this discarded glove, which tells you, again, a story about the man who's sort of come, just thrown his gloves on the floor, is probably not the most respectful of visitors. And Our Awakening Conscience was based on a Dickens story of a woman who was led astray by man, and her family searched for her and attempt to try and get her to come home. But it actually was also based on a real person that Hunt knew. He'd met 16-year-old Annie Miller in a pub. She was practically living in the pub. She was completely destitute. And he'd been incredibly struck by her, and he gave her a place to live. He put her in the care of a woman who looked after her, who found her education, and so on. And of course, we're probably quite familiar with this story. It turned into, eventually, the Pygmalion story that we all know, or My Fair Lady, the other version of it. But what he hoped was, he was in love with Annie, and what he hoped was that she would not become a sex worker, which was there was a lot of pressure to do that for the very, very poor women in Victorian London, that she would not be sort of easily seduced by sort of rich men who made her promises, and that she would get a career of her own, independence, and that when she had that independence, she would choose to be with him. So you can see in this painting, it's shown a woman who's been seduced by a rich man. He set her up in this sort of posh flat, and he shows her actually realizing that this is not what she wants, and that's why it's called The Awakening Conscience. So you can see there's all these sort of signs of danger. There's the tangled threads of her tapestry. There's a piece of music which is called Tears, Idle Tears. You can see there's a cat trying to catch a bird under the table. And in fact, the bird appears to just about be able to, likely to break free, which is just, hang on, there's a catch you can see. Just as she might be. And then in the background, you can see what she's looking at. She's looking through the open window, reflected in the mirror, at the outside world, possibly at freedom. And you can see from her hands, again, you have this wonderful Pre-Raphaelite poetry of hands, that she's sort of taken her hands out of his, that she's sort of, making a decision. Again, you get this sort of focus, I think, on female agency. And even the frame tells us more of the story. The frame is decorated with bells and marigolds, which are both signs of warning. But there is a star in the middle, which suggests the idea of salvation and enlightenment. Now, what actually happened? Did Annie listen to Hunt? Did she listen to the lesson of the painting? No, she actually really enjoyed her independence. She became a very sought-after and successful model. In particular, Rosetti was incredibly keen to paint her. Eventually, she got fed up with Hunt trying to tell her what to do, and she went her own way. And this is a lovely drawing that Rosetti made of Annie in his studio with another artist just after that happened. And I love the informality of it. Rosetti at this time was the partner of Elizabeth Siddal, and this is a lovely drawing here of him sitting to her, of her actually drawing him rather than the other way round. And between both of them had sort of were taking Pre-Raphaelitism in a new direction. They were actually exploring the medieval world and using a medieval world and its medieval style, the world of knights and so on, to explore romantic situations, romantic problems in this sort of safe fantasy space. And so I'll just show you this one. This is a story from Dante of Paolo and Francesca. Francesca fell in love with her teacher, and she kissed him. And her husband saw, and he put them both to death. So when Dante went down to hell with Virgil, he found them in an eternal embrace. And you can see that Francesca is based on Elizabeth Siddal, even the book. And in fact, what looks in the book is a picture that looks very like the picture that we're looking at. And Rosetti was also Elizabeth Siddal's teacher. So this is very much a story which is really about them. Here you can see two paintings in the exhibition, which we're very lucky to have, by Elizabeth Siddal herself, which again use medieval themes to look at modern-day relationship issues. In both these cases, there are women whose men are going away or have gone away. And of course, this was a time of wars when men went away. So the lady and the knight have a very sort of modern resonance. The other painting shows a man who's not coming back from going to sea. And of course, Britain at this point, many people left Britain going to sea. This is one of my favourites, and it's of St. George and the Princess Sabra embracing just before he leaves her to go off on his mission. And I love the way that he is sort of kissing her on the bridge of the nose, and as he embraces her. But some of you might have noticed at the beginning that at the very centre of this picture, there is actually, it's so intimate, she's looped her hair through his armour. Can you see that? But the very centre of the picture are scissors, is a cut, is the sort of separation that's to come. And this very ambivalent picture is about embracing, but also about separation, is because the woman that's depicted is Jane Morris, who was actually in the process of marrying Rosetti's best friend, or one of Rosetti's best friends, William Morris. So not only was he sort of getting distracted from his relationship with Elizabeth Siddal, but also, he was falling in love with his best friend's wife-to-be. And there's a beautiful painting by Morris himself of Jane Morris in the exhibition, which shows her possibly as Guinevere, or it's usually, the usual title is the Belle Isotte. And again, you can see she's like a medieval maiden. And I love the sort of this detail of the unmade bed behind them, and that it's obviously still warm because a little dog has sort of settled himself down on it. But one of the things that around this time, there was a lot of marriages. A lot of the brothers got married. And one of the things they found out was that they didn't like the houses that they were finding. They didn't like the furniture. They didn't like the textiles, the curtains. So they had the idea of designing their own. And out of this came William Morris's firm, which was devoted to textiles, furniture, stained glass, and so on. And Jane Morris, who was a daughter of a saddler, of a stableman, actually became a very important part of that firm. She became a very, very world-famous embroiderer. And so the firm also involved their daughter, May Morris. So the firm involved men and women of the Pre-Raphaelite circle. And of course, I have to just show you this fantastic tapestry, which is a beautiful example of William Morris's company's work, designed by Burne-Jones. He did a lot of designs for them. So just to conclude, what we're moving into here is a second phase of Pre-Raphaelitism, which tends to get called aesthetic Pre-Raphaelitism. And it's a phase in which, led by Rosetti really, the artists became very, very preoccupied with beauty. They were asking the question, what should beauty be like in the modern world? What is a modern beauty? And as you can see, they kind of betrayed their original ideals. They were actually quite often looking at high Renaissance art, not necessarily Raphael, but here you can see Titian or Leonardo da Vinci. There's a beautiful chalk drawing in the exhibition where you can see that Rosetti's been looking at the sfumato, that sort of dusty, soft style of Leonardo da Vinci. But I just wanted to show you, because I noticed this photograph in the gallery, another part of the gallery, the other day, which was actually also an important influence on this chalk drawing, and that's Juliette Margaret Cameron's Enid Sang. And of course, Juliette Margaret Cameron was part of this circle now. She was a very important figure in it, and she was particularly exploring beauty. And one of the things she did, which annoyed a lot of photographers, was she actually started making photographs that were out of focus, because she thought the mystery, the incompleteness, the softness was far more suggestive, far more psychological, far more beautiful. And you can see that, Rosetti is sort of picking up on this idea as well. And I just wanted to, I think probably the most important picture from this phase that's in the exhibition is Rosetti's Beloved, which is it's a very different kind of religious painting than the ones they started off with. And it's a scene from the Song of Solomon where a bride unveils herself to her husband. So it's like a revelation of beauty. And Rosetti has sort of explored the beauty of textiles, the beauty of jewelry, the beauty of flowers, as well as the beauty of women. And the textiles come from all over the world. The bride is wearing a Japanese kimono. There is jewelry from India, from Afghanistan, from Africa. You can see that he's also explored this idea of universal beauty in the figures he's chosen. And what we see here is two models that were very successful in Victorian London in the Pre-Raphaelite circle. We see Anna Ford, who is the bride. We see Ellen Smith, who was a laundress but became a very successful model, who is both the left-hand figures. And then we see Courtney Gray on the right hand, and she was a woman of Romany heritage. And then we see Fanny Eaton, who was a very successful model. Her mother, she was born in Jamaica, her mother was an enslaved woman, but she became a very successful model. And this is one of the things that happened. Whereas everyone criticized the women in Pre-Raphaelite paintings at the beginning, by now they were all the rage. And these models became very famous. They became sort of fashion icons. People copied their look, copied their dress, and so on. We don't know who the black boy is. All we know is that he was in London with an American master, and at the time, this was painted exactly at the time of the American Civil War, and Rosetti was very much sympathetic with the North and the anti-slavery cause. So that there might be a reference to that in this figure. But at the same time, I think there is a rather Victorian and prejudiced idea possibly of a hierarchy of beauty here, with the central figure, the white central figure sort of, I think, reflecting possibly ideas about hierarchy of beauty that we no longer share, thank goodness, today. So to finish, with the Lady of Shalott, and these, the sort of final women that are dealt with by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, we tend to call them femme fatales. They become very fascinated by powerful women, often enchantresses or women of myth. And this was a response to the fact that there was a great movement at this time towards greater women's rights. The Pre-Raphaelite circle associated with people who are campaigning for these, and a kind of, this sort of made itself, showed itself in art with this sort of interest in powerful women, often dangerous women or femme fatale. And of course, the Lady of Shalott is a wonderful example of this. Waterhouse was very preoccupied with the Lady of Shalott. He did several other versions of her. Here she is in her tower, where she's been condemned to just make embroideries from only looking at the world indirectly through a mirror, another mirror. Here she is rejecting that, turning away from the mirror because she's seen Sir Lancelot, she's fallen in love with him, and she wants to go find him. And here she is, sort of quite literally setting herself free. She lets she unchains the boat from what do you call those things? From the mooring, and she's about to sort of float down the river. And even though she knows she's going to die, because she's been condemned to die, if she leaves her prison, she prefers to have freedom and love than to stay incarcerated. And again, you've got this beautiful embroideries and so on. But what's interesting, if we look close at this picture, is that you can see the brushstrokes are very different. Waterhouse has also been looking at Impressionism by this stage. So you sort of get this blend of Impressionism and Pre-Raphaelitism. This is the candle just blowing out as she dies. So the Pre-Raphaelites marketed their paintings in a completely new way. They stopped showing at the Royal Academy, they showed at alternative exhibitions, they showed their pictures on their own and charged people to see them, so it was like a blockbuster film. They tour around the country and you pay your shilling to go and see it. These paintings were toured all around the world, America, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. But they also circulated around in reproductions, huge numbers of reproductions, huge number of prints, so people could have their own Pre-Raphaelite paintings on the walls. And they became incredibly influential and carried on being influential to this day. And I'm just going to sit forward. Just to come back to the Beloved, and a painting I particularly like by Sonia Boyce, who in 1986 took on the Beloved, and she sort of turned it into a self-portrait. So she's turned the boy into the self-portrait of the artist, and she's turned the background, this contemplation of beauty, into a kind of parody of William Morris wallpaper, which I really like. Thank you very much. So we've just got a few minutes if anyone's got any questions. Yes?
If you could just pause a sec for the microphones. Two coming towards you almost immediately. Thank you.
Thank you for such a lovely presentation. It was great, and I think you must have the best job in the world. In the painting Ophelia, I'm just interested in a couple of sections of it. So what's the significance of the arch-like top?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Also, it's almost photorealistic, which seems unusual with the rest of the Pre-Raphaelite paintings that we've seen. And how was it received at the time?
They're all good questions. As you'll notice when you go into the exhibition that these paintings have the most beautiful gold frames. And they're very much like the gold frames we associate with altarpieces or something. And this curved shape also makes it like an altarpiece. And it's quite counterintuitive because you're thinking, okay, we're expecting to see a Holy Family or something underneath that curve. But what the curve does is it kind of gives a sense of something very significant, something spiritually powerful going on, not necessarily religious, but you still get that spiritual intensity, which is one of the reasons they were so interested in religious imagery and religious symbolism. So the other one was the photorealism. I would absolutely agree with that. And of course, this is exactly the Pre-Raphaelites were founded in 1848, and photography was only invented in 1839. And of course, one of the things about photography was that not until the end of the century did it become colour. So there was never any real sort of threat, I think, to painting from photography at this point. And I think what their hyper-realism, they were very interested in photography and they were friends with lots of photographers, but I think what they were really interested in was looking what the world looks like. So he's been fascinated here by the way the light reflects in her eyes, actually sort of trying to be more truthful and more intense, much more truthful than art had been before. And the whole kind of idea of painting outside, that was, really important departure that they made. Of course, the Impressionists took that up about a decade or so later. But these paintings were actually exhibited in Paris in 1855 and were very influential. So that I think that whole idea of getting closer to things, that's what that is. And then your last question was what the reception. I think you can see yourselves that no matter how outraged people were, you can't not be won over by this stuff. It's so that just the skill and the craftsmanship is sort of, you have to admire it. And the sort of, as I say, the sort of the poignancy and the beauty. Millay led the way in winning people over. And incredibly ironically, so this was painted in around 51. By 53, he'd been elected a member of the Royal Academy. And he ended up being the president, actually, in the end of his life. None of the others were ever elected. I think they were thought of as too much trouble.
Yes, Carol, thank you for a fantastic lecture. On this painting, could you use this as an example, perhaps, to elaborate a little on the influence of Ruskin and his call not to embellish nature in all its imperfection, please?
Yeah, so John Ruskin was he was at Oxford University, and his father collected paintings, or his father helped him collect paintings. He was actually he became an art historian really because he wanted to explain to people what was so great about Turner. And that Turner was actually seeing things the way they really looked, like light and mist and so on. But in so doing, he sort of became very convinced that it was important for artists to look at nature. And so when the Pre-Raphaelites came along, he thought, oh, fantastic, these guys are doing something, similar. And they read his books and they got great encouragement from it. And the idea was that in nature was truth, that sort of... one way of putting it, which I quite like, is he had this idea that the world is already a work of art. It's God's work of art. And there is already beauty and meaning in it. You just have to look really, really hard, and that's what artists should do. He didn't stick with that idea. He actually lost his faith later on. But I think Ruskin was the first person that defended the Pre-Raphaelites. He wrote a letter to the Times, he was the person who sort of kind of helped them get over their original problems.
Thanks again for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Given there's such a negative reaction from the rest of the art establishment to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, you mentioned that they then organised for paintings to go on tour in other countries.
Yes.
Do we know how people received those tours, for example, in Australia or the United States or in Europe?
Yeah.
And if it actually had any impact on what was being created in those countries.
Can you put your hand up? I haven't spotted you. Oh, there you are. Okay, thanks. Yes, so I think we've got to bear in mind that they were only outlaws for a few years. And as I say, very quickly they won over people who just could see that their art was fantastic. They got patrons. They won over the public. And they also got younger followers, like people like Burne-Jones and William Morris. By the time they were in their 40s, they were really eligible, and everyone was trying to marry them off. But by the time they were in their 40s, they were actually quite wealthy. They were making quite a lot of money from their art, and they were getting really famous. So really, because they exploited this possibility of an international career, they were sort of first international celebrities. So by the time their work's going abroad, they are celebrities. So and so people are sort of flocking to see the pictures. So we do know quite a lot about the response. And there was actually, so some people found the pictures quite comic. So when William Holman Hunt's The Light of the World came to Australia and South Africa, there was actually an advert in South Africa where they said, they used The Light of the World to advertise metal polish because it's so shiny, or they kind of mocked the intense detail, the sort of earnestness of the detail. But in general, people were absolutely bowled over by it. And when The Light of the World came to Australia, 500,000 people came to see it, which, when you think of what the population of Australia was in those sort of urban centres, it is amazing. Yeah.
Hello, thanks Carol for that. I just have a twofold question. One, there's quite a number of red-headed women in the paintings, so a bit biased myself. But so what was the point of the red-headed women? But I also want to know, my second question is, are there any other art movements that had such a proliferation of red-headed models and women as well?
Not that one I can think of off the top of my head. It's interesting because Jesus had red hair as well in the carpenter's shop that I showed you, and I think it was partly an aesthetic thing. They loved colour, the power of colour, and so a red-headed model could sort of create this wonderful shock of colour. But there is also sort of sense of specialness. I mean, there was this whole pseudoscience at this time called phrenology, which was just awful, and where they sort of thought you could read people's characters by their appearance. And red hair was quite often had negative associations with that science. But that's clearly not the case with the Pre-Raphaelites. It's clearly something they admired, and I don't think it was just the beauty. I think it was a sense of specialness. And so they found a person who could sit for them with red hair. They would fight over who got to, which is one of the reasons Annie Miller was so successful.